Welcome to Downtown Books and Sound. My name is Joe Livernoise, and I'm here with Steve Treder.
Well, it depends on who you talk to, but my dad went with Treder.
Treder, okay. I'm here with Stephen Treder, who's written the definitive book about Horace Stoneham. Fascinating man. He was the owner, general manager of the San Francisco Giants back in the day, even before they came to San Francisco. Way before they came to San Francisco, he was the owner in New York, and he's responsible actually for bringing the Giants to Candlestick Park, which we'll talk about. We'll talk about. Welcome. This is one of a continuing series of book talks here at Downtown Books. Usually Trish is here to do this. She couldn't be here today, so she brought in the lefty to pinch hit. So here I am. And this is a relatively recent development. So this is the first time I've seen this book, and I'm impressed. This is a University of Nebraska Press published book. They're the best. And so you know that it's authoritative and it's a great book. Everything you'll ever need to know about Horace Stoneham. But more importantly, I think, and maybe we'll talk about this, is about the San Francisco Giants back in the day and the evolution of that team, because there was a lot of social issues going on at the time. There was a lot of movement happening at that time, and so we'll be talking a little bit about that. Stephen, thank you for being here.
My great pleasure.
I understand you're from Santa Clara.
I am from Santa Clara, a local California native, born and raised. I've been to Salinas many times, but never been to this great bookstore before.
Isn't it beautiful? Yes,
it
I
is.
know. So I guess the obvious question is, why Horace Stoneham? I mean, there's a lot of baseball players out there. There's a lot of people in baseball. Horace Stoneham is an interesting man, but man.
That very reason is why, because nobody knows Horace Stoneham. Nobody knows who he was. I'm a lifelong San Francisco Giants fan. I was born in Santa Clara. Before I knew it, I was a Giants fan because my parents were Giants fans. So we had the game on the radio all the time. So I loved the Giants, and we knew that the Giants were owned by somebody named Horace Stoneham, but that was about it. Yeah. Beyond that, I had no idea who he was, why he owned the team, none of that. And that was how he wanted it. He didn't want to be a public figure. He didn't want his name in the paper, and so he was in the background. Nobody knew who he was. And it wasn't until years later when I grew up and became a baseball researcher, historian as a hobby, and began to read more about him, I began to realize this guy was not just any other owner. He was really important. He was important, obviously, in the history of the Giants. First of all, he owned the team for 40 years. 40 years is a very long time to own any sports franchise. And he owned them in a very particular 40 years of the mid-century, when so many things were happening. Like you say, the transformation of the United States economy, the east to west migration of businesses, and baseball was only one of them. The racial integration of the sport, racial and cultural integration of the sport. Stoneham was a pioneer and a leader in all that stuff. His story is really important, needs to be told, and nobody had ever told it before. I hang around with a lot of baseball nerd historian types, and we would always talk about, with all the owners at that time, all the baseball executives at that time, everybody knows about Branch Rickey, everybody knows about Walter O'Malley. These names are known. Nobody knows about Horace Stoneham. Somebody ought to write that book. Somebody ought to write that book. And finally, one of my buddies kind of looked at me and said, "Steve, you're the guy who ought to write that book." So I took it upon myself and I wrote that book. And so here it is.
You plunged into it. Well, congratulations. It looks beautiful, and I can't wait to dive into it. I've done a bit of research myself, and a lot of the research had to do with reading your summary through the Saber, which maybe you want to talk a little bit about Saber. But my understanding is Horace Stoneham was he was born into wealth, but he was sort of a ne'er-do-well back in the day, and his dad essentially bought the team to keep him occupied. Is that?
It's not quite that, but it's pretty close.
Mhm.
Now, Horace Stoneham's dad, Charles Stoneham, was a fascinating character in his own right. He was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, right across the river from New York, was a Giants fan as a kid. In fact, he was the Giants became the Giants in the 1880s when Charles Stoneham was 7 years old. So he was a fan even before they were the Giants. Loved the Giants. Went to Wall Street as a child, basically as a kid working. He didn't finish school. Went to work in Wall Street. Made millions of dollars on Wall Street. When $1 million was a lot of money, Charles Stoneham made multiple millions. Was one of the richest men in New York. Was very unsavory, very dishonest, very duplicitous. Was a close friend of Arnold Rothstein, who many baseball fans know. He was the guy who fixed the 1919 World Series.
Right.
That's who Charles Stoneham was. He was a shady character. He bought the Giants because he and his son Horace loved the Giants, and he was a rich guy and he could buy anything he wanted. And so he bought the Giants at this time. Let's remember, this is when the Giants were the biggest team in New York and the biggest sport in the world. The Giants were the biggest franchise you could possibly own in sports. And so Charles bought them for his son Horace, who was a teenager at the time. The idea being that Charles would run the team, but when eventually Horace would inherit the team, he would take over. Well, Horace thought that was great. That was fantastic. But Horace didn't want to actually do any work. He barely graduated high school. His father, who never had an education, wanted more for his son. So he sent him to Fordham University. And Horace dropped out of Fordham University, much to his father's frustration, and he wouldn't go back to college, and his father didn't know what to do with him. So his father, among his many other properties he owned, was a copper mine in Copperopolis, California.
Yeah.
And so he sent young Horace, we were about 19 or 20 years old this time, never worked a day in his life, New York City rich kid, never been out of Manhattan. He sends him on a train across the country to Copperopolis, California, to work in a copper mine. One can only imagine what the miners must have thought of this rich, spoiled kid. But Horace's gift throughout life was that he was a disarming person, very friendly, very charming, very likable. They took a liking to him. He learned through that adventure to respect hard work, to respect the people who did it, to actually be responsible, to show up to work. He may have had little choice in the matter, and who knows what would have happened to him if he hadn't done that. But he did all that. He met his father's expectation of learning responsibility and maturity. And from that adventure, his father finally cabled him or called him back and said, okay, you've proven it to me. Come back to New York and you'll go to work for me and you'll go to work for the Giants. And from that day forward, Horace Stoneham never worked for any other business except for the Giants.
And he wasn't given an executive position from the start, right? I mean, he was like ground up sort of.
Yes, yes. His father, among his other attributes, was his father was a very hard worker and understood the value of work and wasn't going to give his son a cushy job. He made his son go to work. His son worked in all of the departments all around the ball club. And they owned not just the team, they owned the stadium, Polo Ground Stadium in New York. So he could go work in the ticket office, in the maintenance and groundskeeping, equipment, travel arrangements, all of the activities that are required to run a professional baseball team. Horace did them, and so he learned all of the jobs by doing them. And so eventually he earned the right to be his father's apprentice, right-hand man, and all of the employees in the organization respected Horace because they knew that Horace respected them and he knew their jobs. And so it was a very productive way of bringing your rich kid's son in to become the owner. He worked for it. He earned it.
Yeah. Before we go on, I just wanted to say that we're going to be here till 7 o'clock. We might break this off a little earlier. You're welcome to come on by. We have cookies. We have some beverages of different types of. I understand there's a little something under the counter. I don't know.
There may be some wine involved.
You can meet the author. He'll sign some autographs. We're talking baseball, so autographs.
I like all. Let's go with autographs.
Yeah, autographs. So, Horace ended up taking over the team at the point where his dad died. Right? Is that and became the youngest baseball executive at the time?
It's a little. It's not. It's very close. Either he was the very youngest, or Phil Wrigley, who inherited the Cubs from his dad at about the same time. I'm not exactly sure. They were very close, but Horace was a very young man. He wasn't yet 33 years old when he inherited the Giants in early 1936. But like I say, he knew the business. He'd done all the jobs, and so there was no worry on the part of the sports writers and everything that he wouldn't be ready for the job. He was ready for the job. And, being that age, he was able to own the team through his entire adulthood.
And he had success with the team. They won World Series.
They won World Series right off the bat.
Yeah.
Well, we won pennants anyway right off the bat. But that was not Horace's team. That was the team he inherited. That team, this was in the mid-30s, that team, which was managed and run by Bill Terry, that team began to age out. And in the 1940s, the team had less success. And simultaneously, the Dodgers, who had been the ne'er-do-well team in New York, the Dodgers were on the rise. They surpassed the Giants in the standings in the National League and in attendance. And so it was in 1948 that Horace Stoneham, feeling kind of desperate, did the impossible, the unthinkable. He reached over to Brooklyn and hired away their very famous and mercurial manager, Leo DeRocher, to come manage the Giants, which shocked everyone. But it was with DeRocher that the Giants began to be successful again, and they won 2 pennants with DeRocher in 1951 and 54.
Right. And then, so at what point, so when was Jackie Robinson signed by the Dodgers? What year was that?
Jackie Robinson was signed by the Dodgers in 1946.
And then,
well, actually in the fall of 1945. He played his first year in 1946 in the minor leagues, and then came to the major leagues with the Dodgers in 47. And that was obviously a momentous thing that sort of stunned the world. Horace Stoneham, therefore, was not the first team to integrate. He watched and saw how that went. But by 1949, Horace was ready to integrate. And we properly honor Branch Rickey and the Dodgers for being the first. That was, a hugely vital step. But Horace Stoneham, though he wasn't the first, Horace Stoneham did it better than the Dodgers. He not only racially integrated the Giants by hiring African-American players to come play for the team, he also hired a fellow by the name of Alejandro Pompez, who was the owner of the New York Cuban Giants, the Negro League team that played in New York, played in the Polo Grounds. That was their stadium. And so Horace Stoneham was Alex Pompez's landlord. So that way he got to know Pompez. Pompez came to work for the Giants and brought with him his network of scouts. So the Giants became not only a racially integrated team, but a racially integrated organization. And they were more successful than the Dodgers at bringing in not only African-American players, but Latin American players from all over Latin America, from the Dominican Republic, from Cuba, from Venezuela. And the Giants through the 1950s and 60s were far and away the most racially and culturally integrated team in baseball, team in sports. It was a remarkable achievement, and nobody knew about it. Horace Stoneham did not toot his own horn, didn't make a big deal about it, but it was an amazing achievement.
Well, and I don't know how much you address this in the book, but I guess Alvin Dark, the manager Alvin Dark, was an issue because he held some rather provocative views about race and in a team, and was trying to lead a team that was very integrated.
Yes, Horace Stoneham was not perfect. He made mistakes. He did great things. He also made mistakes. Among the mistakes he made was hiring Alvin Dark to be his manager in 1961. This is after the team had moved to San Francisco. Dark had been a star player for the Giants. In fact, Stoneham had made a trade that acquired him for the Giants. A star player, a team leader, team captain. Nobody doubted Dark's baseball savvy, his leadership skill. He was qualified on that account. But he was a white guy from the South, and his racial perspective was not the right one for this team. The Giants in the 1960s had a very diverse clubhouse, not just black players, but Latin players, and Dark antagonized everybody and got along with almost none of the players. And so it really, really went very badly with Dark and the Giants. Dark lasted just 4 years, and before the whole thing came to a crisis, and he was He was let go following the 1964 season.
Well, I got a little ahead of ourselves here because there was the move to the West, and the Dodgers and the Giants both were pioneers coming here. And the reason Stoneham was so interested in moving west was because they were playing at the Polo Grounds, right? And the Polo Grounds had no parking. Parking was an issue, sort of like Salinas. Kidding, but
the Polo Grounds and Ebbets Field, the Dodgers Park in Brooklyn, was the same thing. These were great ballparks for their time. They were the state of the art when they were built in the early 20th century. But by the 1950s, the world had changed, and people were no longer traveling on the subway. They were using automobiles. In the 1920s and 30s, rich people had cars, but most people didn't. By the 1940s and 50s, everybody had cars. It was the norm. And they were therefore able to move out of the inner city, out to live in the suburbs, which were booming and roads were being built. So by the 1950s, if you wanted people to come into downtown, to come to your ballpark, they had to be able to drive in on freeways, and they had to have places to park. Well, the Polo Grounds nor Ebbets Field offered either of those things. So the Giants and the Dodgers, and not just them, other teams as well in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, they were really struggling to capture fans. And so they had to be able to accommodate automobiles, and there was no ballpark in New York. There was talk at the time they would develop a new one, and it eventually became Shea Stadium out in Flushing, but it wasn't being built in the 50s. And Stoneham and O'Malley both kind of looked at each other and said, "We can't wait around for this. We got to go." The best thing for both of us is not just to move, but move together, to move in partnership to California. Los Angeles and San Francisco are perfect rival cities. We can keep the team rivalry alive. They're great, booming, growing markets. It was a huge revolutionary step at the time. No team had moved anywhere near the West Coast, but the Giants and Dodgers did it. It was a risk, but it was hugely successful.
Were teams still traveling by train at the time?
Mostly they were. It wasn't until the development of jet aircraft in the 1950s. Before then, there were airplanes to go from East Coast to the West, but there weren't nonstop flights. They had to stop and refuel. It took hours and hours. It was dangerous as well as slow. It wasn't until the popularization of jet aircraft in the 1950s that it became practical to have teams travel that far.
So who built that Candlestick Park? Now, my understanding, let me see if this is correct, is that Horace Stoneham didn't really care about the stadium. He was more interested in the parking.
Yeah, he cared about the stadium too. He wanted a modern stadium that would be, purpose-built, that would have the modern structural amenities. The old ballparks, for example, had pillars in the way of the fans. Right. This one would be cantilevered, modern construction. So he wanted that. But the main issue for him was parking. If he didn't have 10,000 or 15,000 parking spaces, it didn't matter what the ballpark was. That was the crucial thing. So Candlestick Park was built not by Horace Stoneham. He didn't own it. It was built by the city and county of San Francisco. It was built for the purpose of attracting a major league team. The bond issue was passed in 1953 for the purpose of building the new ballpark to attract the team. The story behind Candlestick Park is that there was rampant corruption in San Francisco.
No.
Yeah, hard as this may be to believe. And so the site of Candlestick Park was chosen not because it was a good site, but because the developer, Charles Harney, was able to buy that unused wasteland at pennies an acre and then get on the commission to choose the site, choose this site, sell the land back to the city at thousands an acre, and oh, by the way, give himself the no-bid contract to build a stadium. That's why it was there. It was the worst possible location in the Bay Area you could put a stadium because it was windy and foggy and miserable all the time. And so Candlestick Park, while it was, for the time, it was a brand new state-of-the-art facility, its location was awful. There were, poor decisions made in design and in construction of it that made it not fulfill its promise. It became one of the problems that Horace Stoneham had. It's sustaining its success in San Francisco. Once there were alternatives for people to go to games other than the Giants, for instance, the Oakland A's arriving in 1968, once that happened, Candlestick Park was just dead weight on the Giants, and it really, really was one of the key issues that forced Horace Stoneham to have to sell the team.
And my understanding that Horace Stoneham really didn't spend a whole lot of time in San Francisco on the site, Candlestick Point, overseeing or even paying much attention to the conditions around there while it was being built.
He didn't, but that you probably heard this story. There's a famous story that the city fathers of San Francisco took Horace Stoneham out to have him visit the site, but they were careful to bring him out at noontime when it was sunny and the wind wasn't blowing yet, and then whisk him back downtown before the wind and the fog came in. That story is probably not true, and even if it is true, Horace Stoneham had no choice. It wasn't his decision where the ballpark was built. He was the tenant. He was just going to rent it. He did spend a lot of time there once it was built. He went to every game. He was dedicated. He went to every game. And so he learned firsthand just what a bad place it was. But this time it was a fait accompli. He had no choice.
Yeah. Well, so bringing the team over to the West Coast is one thing. Fielding a competitive team is another, and that was always a struggle for us, right? I mean, I
wouldn't call it a struggle. He was unusual among baseball owners, in that he didn't just own the team; he ran it. He was the general manager as well as the owner, which is a very rare thing. Yeah. The only two examples that are comparable to it in his time were Connie Mack of the A's. Connie Mack owned the team, managed the team, and ran it. Yeah. And the Washington Senators, owned by Calvin and Clark, and then Calvin Griffith, kind of similar to the Stonehams. That was a similar deal where they kind of ran the operation. Mm-hmm. But most other teams, that's not how you did it. You were the owner. You hired a general manager who's the one who decided who's on the roster, what trades do we make, all the decisions about building the team. Horace Stoneham did all of that himself. He wasn't brilliant at it, but he was good at it. He knew about the need to attract raw talent, and so he was innovative in building a farm system to develop young players and stocking that farm system not just with white kids, but with black kids, with Latin kids. So he built a great pool of talent. The Giants were very competitive through the 50s and 60s. They were very good. They weren't great. Where he wasn't successful is that sort of the last mile. He could get them in contention. They were in contention every year, but winning. They won just one pennant in San Francisco in 1962. They finished in second place 5 consecutive years, setting a record for second place finishes. But he was very good, but not great at that.
Interesting. Well, and one of the things I forgot until I was reading through the Sabre article, he developed Casa Grande.
Yes.
And talk about a folly.
It was a brilliant idea. Got a couple of the details wrong.
Okay.
Horace Stoneham loved the desert. He first probably saw it. We know he first saw it when he came out to Copperopolis. He had to cross the Nevada desert by train to get there. He loved the desert, and in late 1940s, he and Bill Veeck, who was the owner of the Cleveland Indians, they were the first major league teams to do their spring training in Arizona. Mm-hmm. The weather was great. The real estate was cheap. And so Horace Stoneham figured, if we're going to do spring training out here, I could do a real estate development. And so he figured that if he built a training complex for the Giants, this would attract fans to come in and watch the spring training games. And then he could also develop home sites, real estate, developments around the resort complex and sell homes. And this would make him a revenue stream outside of the Giants. That was a great idea. In fact, it was decades ahead of its time. Teams do that all the time now. They didn't then. The problem was his choice of location. He chose Casa Grande because it was a small town just about halfway between Phoenix to the north and Tucson to the south. And he figured, well, teams are going to be in both Phoenix and Tucson. There's going to be traffic back and forth. I'll be right in the middle. I'll be in the center of all of the baseball activity in Arizona. Well, the problem was it didn't develop that way. Phoenix developed and Tucson developed, but Casa Grande out there in the middle never developed. And so he sunk a ton of money into developing not just the training complex, but a high-rise hotel and a golf course and a wonderful resort that was well populated for a couple of weeks during spring training, but otherwise just sat idle year-round, and he lost a ton of money. The Giants were his only business. He didn't have any other sources of revenue, and if this was another problem for him. If the Casa Grande adventure wasn't bringing revenue in, was in fact sucking it out, it was another thing that bogged down his financial state.
Well, I was going to ask. So was from a financial point of view, were the Giants ever a money-making team for him in San Francisco?
Oh yeah, they were.
Okay.
They were profitable for the first 10 years.
Okay.
For the first 10 years in San Francisco, before the A's arrived, the Giants' attendance was very good. They were a top contending team. They had Willie Mays and Willie McCovey on their show. They had big stars. They contended every year. They'd only won one pennant, but they were in the pennant race every year. So there was lots of interest in the team. They weren't the Dodgers. They weren't the Yankees. They weren't a mega successful team, but they were profitable. It's beginning in the late '60s when the A's arrived, and so there's competition. When the Casa Grande misadventure is just drawing more and more money out of him, that he begins to develop financial trouble, and it just got worse and worse and worse until finally in 1975 he was forced to sell the team, which was heartbreaking because they weren't just his favorite team, they weren't just his life's work, they were the gift given to him by his father, whom he revered, and he wasn't able to sustain the family legacy. It was really hard for him.
Yeah. So at that point, who did he sell to?
He sold to a fellow named Bob Lurie.
That's what I was going to say.
Bob Lurie was the son of a famous San Francisco real estate magnate. Bob Lurie's family owned the Mark Hopkins Hotel and a bunch of other properties. Bob Lurie was on the Giants board, so he's a minor investor in the Giants. The reason Stoneham sold to Lurie is because Lurie's promise was, I won't just buy the team, I'll keep them in San Francisco. Yeah. Other than that, Stoneham was going to sell the team to a group from Toronto, and the Giants were going to leave.
And what year? That was in '75.
'75. Yeah.
So Giants,
it was an eerie premonition.
Yeah.
The Giants were almost sold to Toronto in '75, but the last day before the sale is going to go through, Lurie comes in and buys. Yeah. The exact same scenario takes place. Let me see. 18 years later, when Lurie has finally had it with Candlestick Park, and he's done, he wants out, he was going to sell the team to a group from Tampa Bay, Florida. And they were this close to selling to Tampa Bay. At the last minute, Peter McGowan comes in and saves the team and keeps them in San Francisco, and then, of course, builds the wonderful new ballpark.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you're researching the book, and researching the life, was there anything that really stood out for you? What were the big surprises about this gentleman?
The image, the limited public image that Horace Stoneham had was that he was a nice guy, but not very bright, not very hardworking, kind of an easygoing bumbler. That it was Walter O'Malley's idea to move to California, and Stoneham just, okay, good, I guess so. None of that is true. Okay. Stoneham was very bright, very ambitious, very hardworking. He was shy, and he was not a good public speaker, and he didn't give good quotes, and so the press never wrote him up. But he was a good person. His employees were extremely loyal to him. He moved, not just the team, but the whole front office moved from New York to San Francisco. People don't move across the country with their boss unless they really, really like their boss and believe in him. He was a good manager. He was a good people person. He took care of his Giants employees. He was a good man. And that part of it, that part of his personality had never been understood.
Yeah. So there's obviously you grew up a Giant fan, right? So and so there's that passion around that team. What is the psychology behind that? Because I'm a huge Giant fan myself, and I never really understood why, because they never won. They were always in the hunt, but they never actually won anything. And can you explain this?
You're bringing me back to my undergraduate days when my senior thesis was attempting to get at what is it about sports team fandom? How does this work? And I hesitate to point out, I didn't solve the riddle. I don't know the answer. I can tell you that it's complex. I can tell you that it involves identifying with a tribe, a community that is us versus them over there. It's a way of finding community and sort of camaraderie. I think also that part of the test of your fandom is that you're a fan even when they don't win. In fact, especially when they don't win. The true fan is a fan through thick and thin. We true fans who are psychologically disturbed, we dismiss. We don't like those fans who only pay attention when the team's good, and as soon as they struggle, they got nothing to do. No, a true fan, it's not rational. It's not logical. It's the opposite. It's emotional. It's a commitment that I've made, and I'm going to write it out through thick and thin. And trust me, as a Giants fan, through the 70s and 80s, I wrote some pretty.
So there were some dark times.
Yes, there were.
There was the Johnny Lamaster years.
Yes, there were. Yes, there were.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So is Bob Lurie your next book? Is this?
The Bob Lurie book has been written. The fellow who sat across the table from me and said, "Steve, you ought to write this book." He was working on the Bob Lurie book. Well, actually, it was not Bob Lurie, but the history of the Giants in San Francisco. He wrote the book. My next book project, thank you for bringing that up. I haven't started yet, but I've begun to think about it, is the history of professional baseball in the state of California.
Oh, wow.
Not just the Giants and the Dodgers and major leagues, but also the whole minor league level that goes through that, and how the economy and the social development of California through the 20th century can sort of be interpreted through professional baseball.
I look forward to that. That was at a time. I mean, we're talking at the early 1900s, the aughts, when you could field a professional baseball team called the San Jose Prune Pickers.
Yes.
And the Fresno had they had another odd little name for their team too, but they were big. They were popular teams, and the Los Angeles Angels have been around since forever. 1903, and always with a PCL. Well, good for you. I look forward to that one too.
It'll be a few years out.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say the obsession that has to go into. Obsession might be the wrong
that's
word.
Not too strong a word at all.
To write a book like this, how long did this take? And what's your day job?
My day job is I'm a management consultant. Is the easiest term to describe it. I'm a knowledge worker. That's my day job. That pays the bills. Much as I would love you to buy this book, it doesn't pay the bills. It took me. From the time I decided to do it, it took me 7 years, but it took me a couple of years before I decided to do it to really actually sit down and start doing it. So it was about 5 years of actual work. A lot of that was research. So probably about 50% research, 50% writing. And it was nights and weekends. It wasn't all day.
Right.
But my wife can attest. I was obsessively focused on it. It took many, many hours, but you don't work on a project like this unless it's something you're sincerely interested in. And I wanted to know this story myself. I wanted the story to be told, and so I was motivated to get it done.
And at what point did the University of Nebraska press pop into this? And how much was there a lot of work?
I have good things to say about University of Nebraska. I this buddy of mine who suggested this to me, as well as other friends of mine I know who've written books. They typically sell the concept to the publisher before it's written. They maybe write a chapter or two in an outline, and they say, "Would you publish this?" And they say yes. But then once that happens, you're on their timetable, and you have to deliver chapters and a full manuscript by X date, or you're in breach of contract. I didn't want to do that, and so I decided I'm going to write the whole manuscript complete, and then I'll shop it to publishers. So I took a risk that nobody would ever publish it, but I had a pretty good idea. So once the manuscript was complete, then I shopped it to a couple of publishers, Nebraska being one of them, and I eventually chose Nebraska. The other publisher I really liked but they basically said, nah, your book's too long. We need to cut this, cut that. It needs to fit into our template. And Nebraska, they said, no, it's a big book, but it's a big story. We'll go with it. They allowed me to publish my book. They did give me excellent editing support.
Good.
Because I cut probably 20% to reach this length.
Yikes.
But it was the right 20%.
Oh, good.
And it was, it really did bring it down to a not just a scale, but a pace that is readable.
Yeah.
They were terrific. I would recommend. They are not really helpful once the book's published.
Yeah, you're on your own.
Kind of on your own. But boy, to get it published, they were very helpful.
Yeah. Well, I believe I'm doing another interview with a publisher on December 10th, and it will be here with someone by the name of Catherine Pendergrass, who wrote just fascinating book about the founding of Carmel by the Sea, which you'd think, the bohemian art lifestyle of the time. It was dark and it was disturbing, and she has done such a wonderful job with that. And I'm really looking forward. But that's another, I believe, University of Nebraska book. And I guess my point is that publishers don't typically, what you usually hear from agents and publishers is, oh, that's too regional. And particularly when it comes to the West Coast, they're not interested because it's too regional. It doesn't have the broad appeal. But that, to have niche publishers like University of Nebraska out there doing this sort of work is, bless their heart.
Their catalog is really good. It's high quality, and they're not interested in bestsellers. They're interested in books that are of real value, of lasting value. They sell to libraries. Mm-hmm. So they want to publish really good material that fills a need within a particular specialty that hasn't been written before. So.
Well, thank you, Steve. I'm told that we're about out of time here, so I wanted to thank you. We've got about 20 minutes. You can drop in. There's still books, a couple books left. Grab one. I know it's going to be a fascinating read. Stephen will autograph the book for you if you show up in the next 20 minutes. So please come by and share some cookies and share some beverages. My name is Joe Livernoise. I'm one of the editors of Voices of Monterey Bay, and I also write a little historical Patreon thing called Where the Bodies Are Buried, and it's the history of Monterey County. I recently did a story about the first Monterey County baseball player to play for in the major leagues, and he was a Yankee before there were Yankees. Fellow by the name of Harry Walter. So
Santa Clara Bronco, by the way.
Yeah, and he was the Santa Clara Bronco, and he coached Stanford at the end. So another fascinating man, probably not worthy of a 550-page book, but you can read about him at Where the Bodies Are Buried. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I had a good time. I don't know about Steve. I don't know about the audience here, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Trish. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.